Welcome to another deep dive. You ready to get into some philosophy of biology?
Absolutely. I'm excited for this one natural selection. It's a concept everyone thinks they know, right? But then you start digging deeper and oh boy.
Yeah, you realize there's a lot more to it than meets the eye. We all remember Darwin, of course, the big name, the theory laid out on the origin of species back in 1859. But we're going beyond the basics here.
Right. This is for our listeners who are ready to think philosophically about it, really get into those subtle nuances, how contemporary philosophers are grappling with natural selection.
We'll be diving deep into the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, entry on natural selection. So this is cutting-edge stuff, folks, reflecting the latest debates in the field.
And trust me, it's more complicated than you might think. We're going to unpack all those different ways philosophers and biologists are understanding and using this idea of natural selection.
You might even come away questioning some things you thought were settled.
That's the beauty of philosophy, isn't
Yeah.
it? Okay, so one of the first things that jumps out when you start looking at this philosophically is that even within biology, there isn't one universally agreed upon definition of natural selection.
Right, we all think we know what it is, but when you really press on it.
Exactly. Philosophers have identified at least two main ways the term gets used, and they've cleverly labeled them focused and capacious.
Love a good label. Makes them
Yeah.
easy to remember. So what's the deal with this focused usage? What does it mean for someone trying to think about it philosophically?
So the focused view, like the name suggests, it's zeroing in on a very specific element of Darwin's whole process. It's often used in those really formal mathematical models of evolution, trying to really pinpoint things in a very precise way.
Makes sense. So it's almost like making it amenable to that very rigorous kind of reasoning that we do in philosophy, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And we see this reflected in how philosophers are interpreting terms within these mathematical frameworks.
Exactly.
Like take type recursions, for example. Those fitness coefficients, those little W's you see in the equations, those are often interpreted as a way to quantify selection, to actually put a number on it.
Try to get a handle on it.
Yeah, exactly. And then you've got the price equation, another powerful tool there. The interpretation is all about statistical relationships, covariances between how many offspring you have and what traits they have. That's seen as a way to measure selection.
It can seem pretty abstract, though. Can you give us some concrete examples of philosophers who are actually using this focused definition?
Oh, yeah, tons. So, for instance, you've got Roberta Milstein. She talks about selection as discriminate sampling.
Okay.
It's this idea that some variants are more likely to end up in the next generation because of their traits, the fitter ones.
Right, that makes sense.
It's a very specific aspect of the whole process, and you can capture it nicely in mathematical models. Then you've got Jun Otsuka. He's all about causal graphical models.
Okay, I love those visual aids.
Right, you can actually see the cause and effect relationships. And he pinpoints natural selection as that specific causal influence of an organism's traits on the number of offspring it produces.
Interesting. So there's a causal story being told there?
Yeah, exactly. And then you've got Samir Okasha. He interprets that covariance from the price equation as, a really precise way to quantify the causal influence of selection.
So it seems like with this focused definition, they're being very careful about what they're not including in the definition itself.
Yes, absolutely. That's crucial for philosophical clarity.
So what are they leaving out?
Well, things like inheritance, the actual mechanisms of how traits get passed down, and replication making copies, it's isolating that one event of differential success from all the stuff that leads up to it and all the consequences.
So it's like a snapshot in time, a very precise slice of the whole process.
That's a great way to put it. It's about getting that clean, mathematically tractable concept of what it means for one variant to be favored over another in a single generation.
Okay, I see how that would be useful for certain types of analysis. But I'm also already starting to see where some philosophical puzzles might arise.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And you're right on the money. There are some huge debates that come out of this very narrow definition. One of the big ones is, how do you even distinguish this focused notion of selection from genetic drift?
Right, so drift is just those random fluctuations in gene frequencies, pure chance.
Exactly. But if selection is defined so narrowly as just differential representation, how do you rigorously separate that from changes that are happening randomly?
Seems tricky.
Very tricky. It gets really philosophical really fast. And then there's another major question that comes up.
Lay it on me.
Should we even be thinking of selection in this focused sense as a cause at all?
Whoa, now that's a really fundamental question.
Isn't it? It gets right to the heart of what we mean by causation. If it's not a cause, what is it?
Yeah, is it just a description, a way of summarizing an outcome rather than something actively shaping populations?
That's the debate. And it ties in with all sorts of other philosophical questions about agency and the nature of its scientific explanation. We'll definitely get more into causation later on. But for now, let's switch gears and look at the capacious usage.
Right, this one sounds like it's taking a much broader, more holistic view of natural selection.
Yeah, exactly. It's trying to capture the whole shebang, the complete cycle of Darwin's process, not just one isolated element.
Okay, so it's like putting all the ingredients back in the pot.
That's a good analogy. It's including everything that's essential for evolutionary change to happen through natural selection.
So who are the big names associated with this capacious view?
Well, you've got Richard Lewontin and a lot of theorists who followed in his footsteps. They're famous for proposing these sets of conditions that they argue are absolutely necessary for evolution by natural selection to occur.
Okay, so what are these magic conditions?
The usual suspects, really, variation within a population, gonna have something for selection to act on, right?
Right, makes sense.
Then those variations have to be heritable, offspring gotta resemble their parents to some extent.
Okay.
And finally, you need differential reproductive success based on those variations. Some individuals gotta be better at surviving and reproducing than others.
So variation, inheritance, and reproduction. Those are the big three for this capacious view.
Those are the pillars. But here's the thing, and this is crucial to keep in mind from a philosophical perspective.
Hit me with it.
Even though those elements, those big three, are seen as integral parts of natural selection in this broader view, they're treated as separate, distinct concepts from natural selection when the term is used in that focused way we were just talking about.
Oh, right. So it all comes down to how you're using the term.
It's all about context.
Yeah.
One is broad and inclusive, trying to give you a full picture of the process.
Yeah.
And the other is narrow and specific, zeroing in on a specific component that you can measure and analyze.
Okay, so we've got these two very different ways of thinking about natural selection. And now it's time to bring in the big E word, evolution itself.
Right, because that's what it's all about in the end, isn't it?
Yeah, and philosophers, they love to get specific about conditions and definitions.
Huh.
So what's all this philosophical fuss about figuring out the exact conditions under which evolution by natural selection occurs?
That's a great question, and it really gets to the heart of what philosophy of science is all about. I mean, think about it. It's similar to other philosophical problems we wrestle with, like trying to define what causation really means. What does it actually mean for one thing to cause another?
Yeah, that's a rabbit hole for sure.
Totally. So Darwin's theory, it explains so much of the natural world, right? It's this incredibly powerful framework. And philosophers, we want to know exactly when it's appropriate to use it. When are we justified in saying, aha, this is a case of evolution by natural selection?
It's about figuring out the boundaries of the theory, where it applies and where it might not.
Exactly. And if we can get really clear on those conditions, then we can start asking even bigger philosophical questions, like, do similar principles apply in other domains?
Yeah, like what?
Like the evolution of ideas or cultural practices. Some people even wonder if there are analogous processes happening at completely different scales, like in cosmology.
Whoa, that's mind-blowing.
It's about trying to find that underlying logic of selective processes wherever they might exist.
Okay, so let's get down to brass tacks. What are some of the attempts that philosophers have made to really lay out the logical skeleton of Darwin's argument, as Lewontin called it?
Well, Lewontin himself, he gave us one of the most influential formulations back in 1970. He said you need three key things. First, phenotypic variation. Individuals in a population got to be different in their observable traits, different colors, sizes, behaviors, all that.
Okay.
Second, differential fitness. Those different phenotypes can't all be equally good at surviving and reproducing in a given environment. Some got to have an edge.
Right. Got to be some winners and losers.
Exactly. And third, heritability of fitness offspring gotta tend to resemble their parents in terms of how many offspring they produce. Traits associated with higher fitness gotta be getting passed down.
So variation, differential fitness, and heritability. Those sound like the classic ingredients of natural selection.
They are. But here's the thing. Lewontin, he actually offered another formulation a few years later.
Oh, there's a twist.
Always a twist with philosophers, right? So in this later version from 1978, he still has three principles, but there are some subtle but important differences.
Okay, let's hear them.
So first, he's more specific about the variation. He says it has to be within a single species.
Okay, that makes sense.
Second, it's the traits themselves that need to be heritable, not necessarily the fitness.
So it's not just about passing down the ability to have lots of babies. It's about passing down the specific features that might lead to having more babies.
Exactly. And third, he just says differential reproductive success, which is basically the same as his earlier differential fitness.
Okay, so a bit more nuance, a bit more fine-tuning in the later version.
And those subtle changes, they reflect a deeper engagement with the complexities of how traits and fitness are related. It's not always straightforward.
Right, nothing in biology ever is. And I'm guessing these formulations haven't exactly escaped criticism from other philosophers?
Oh, philosophers, we love to poke holes in each other's arguments. So, yeah, there have been some pretty sharp critiques of Lewontin's conditions.
Like
Well, for one, some philosophers, they say, hey, he's missing something crucial: population.
populations.
Yeah, Lewontin talks about species, but not all members of a species are necessarily part of one big interbreeding population where selection is actually happening.
Okay, so you could have different groups within a species experiencing different selective pressures.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And another point of contention is that there's no explicit mention of Darwin's idea of this struggle for existence.
Right, that competition for resources, mates, all that.
Yeah, some philosophers, they see that as a core driver of selection, and they think Lewontin's conditions leave it out.
Okay, so some potential omissions.
Mm-hmm.
But have philosophers come up with any real counterexamples to Lewontin's conditions, either in thought experiments or actual biological systems?
Oh, yeah. Tons. It's a philosophical playground out there.
Give me some examples.
So, for instance, you've got Eugene Earnshaw White. He came up with this hypothetical scenario where offspring don't inherit their parents' specific traits, but they still end up evolving in a stable way because of the selective pressures.
Okay, how does that work?
Well, imagine a trait that influences survival, but it's not directly passed down from parent to offspring.
Mm-hmm.
So even though there's no inheritance in the traditional sense, selection is still acting on those traits and shaping the population over time.
Interesting. So it's like selection is operating on the level of the trait itself, rather than the genes that encode it.
Yeah, that's one way to think about it.
Yeah.
And then Earnshaw White, he also pointed out that if the heritability of a trait varies between different variants, that itself can drive evolution, even without initial differences in fitness.
Okay, so heritability is playing an active role in the evolutionary process, not just a passive one.
Right. And then you've got Peter Godfrey Smith. He's a master of coming up with these thought-provoking examples.
You got.
Well, he's pointed out cases where populations evolve because of differences in generation time.
Okay, so one type reproduces faster than another.
Exactly. Even if they don't differ in the average number of offspring they have per generation, the one that goes through generations faster is going to spread its genes quicker.
So it's like a time advantage.
Right. And all these examples, they really force us to think carefully about what's truly essential for evolutionary change. It's not always as clear-cut as we might think.
Okay, so we've seen that evolution can happen, even if Lewontin's conditions aren't perfectly met. What about the flip side? Can you have a system that meets all the conditions, but doesn't evolve?
That's another great question. And the answer is, yep, that can happen too. It's a philosophical puzzle for sure.
Give me an example.
So both Godfrey Smith and Benjamin Jansen, they've talked about the case of stabilizing selection.
Okay, I remember that from Bio 101.
Yeah.
It's where selection favors the average, the middle ground.
Exactly. So you can have variation, heritability, differential reproductive success, all the Lewontin stuff.
Uh-huh.
But the selective pressures, they're constantly pushing the population towards that middle ground, that average trait value.
So no one phenotype really gets the upper hand.
Right. And the population can just stay stuck in that distribution of traits. No real directional change.
So it's like selection is working to maintain stability rather than drive change?
Exactly. And Jansen, he even raises this deeper point.
What's that?
He says, can we even tell if a system is undergoing selection without already having some idea of what counts as selection?
Oh, so it's like a chicken and egg problem.
Yeah, it's this potential circularity that philosophers are always worried about.
We got to watch out for that.
We do. So you can see formulating a set of conditions that's universally applicable and philosophically airtight.
Yeah.
It's a tall order.
It's a challenge for sure. Seems like philosophers and biologists are still working on it.
Oh, yeah, it's an ongoing project. And that's what makes it so interesting. So amidst all this debate, are there any alternative approaches that philosophers have taken?
Yeah. What else is out there?
Well, Samir Okasha, he's come up with a really interesting proposal.
What's his take?
He's drawing on the price equation, that mathematical framework we talked about earlier. And he says, look, what really matters is the statistical covariance between how many offspring a parent has and the average trait value of those offspring.
Okay, so basically are parents with lots of kids tending to have kids with a certain trait?
Yeah, that's the key. So then you've got selection happening on that trait.
Makes sense. But what makes Okasha's approach different?
Well, his formulation, it actually allows for the possibility of selection happening without any evolution.
Oh, hold on. How can that be?
So imagine this. You've got selection favoring a particular trait, right?
Okay.
But there's also some bias against that trait when it gets passed down to the next generation.
Okay, so like maybe it's harder for individuals with that trait to find mates or something?
Exactly. So
Yeah.
you've got these two opposing forces, selection pushing one way and transmission bias pushing the other.
And they cancel each other out.
Exactly. You get selection happening in each generation, but no net change in the population over time. It's like a tug of war where both sides are equally strong.
That's wild. So selection can be happening, but evolution isn't necessarily happening.
It's a subtle but really important distinction, and it highlights the difference between the forces acting on a population and the actual changes in its composition.
Okay, so we've been talking about these different ways of conceptualizing selection.
Yeah.
But the source material also brings up this thing called replicator selectionism.
Ah, yes, a classic.
What's the philosophical gist of that one?
So replicator selectionism, it's basically saying, hey, let's shift our focus a bit. Instead of thinking about organisms or populations as the main things being selected,
Okay.
let's look at those underlying units of heredity, those replicators.
Wow.
And what's the most famous replicator of them all?
Genes.
Genes, exactly. So this view, it's kind of a gene-centered perspective on evolution.
Right. Genes are calling the shots.
In a way, yeah. And this whole idea, it came about partly from philosophers thinking hard about inheritance and realizing that some genetic elements, they can spread even if they don't benefit the organism as a whole.
So it's like a selfish gene kind of view.
Exactly. And two of the big names here are Richard Dawkins and David Hull. They both offer definitions of what a replicator is.
What did they say?
Well, Dawkins, he said, a replicator is anything that makes copies of itself with high fidelity.
Okay, so basically good at making accurate copies.
Right. And Hull, he emphasized the transmission of structure across generations. So you've got to be able to pass on your structure relatively intact for your lineage to continue.
Okay, so good copying and structural continuity.
Those are the key ideas. And they also made some other distinctions that are important philosophically.
Like what?
Well, they talked about germline replicators versus somatic replicators.
Okay, remind me what those are again.
So germline replicators, those are the ones that have the potential to go on indefinitely. You know, their lineage can keep going through the generations.
Okay, so like the genes in sperm and egg cells.
Exactly. And somatic replicators, those are the ones in your regular body cells. Their lineage kind of stops with you when you die.
Right, so they don't get passed on to the next generation.
And Dawkins, he made this argument that natural selection, it's going to happen anywhere you find these active germline replicators.
Okay.
Active meaning,
Meaning they have some causal influence on how likely they are to get copied.
so they're not just passive passengers. Nope, they're playing the game. So this leads to this whole philosophical argument about genes being the primary unit of selection in the long run.
Because they're the ones getting passed down through the generations.
Exactly.
Fair
It's a
enough.
powerful idea, but of course it's not without its critics.
Oh, I'm sure philosophers have had a field day with this one.
They have. So some people, they point out that genes don't have to be in the germline to undergo selection-like processes.
Okay, give me an example.
Well, take the immune system. Your immune cells, they're constantly evolving and adapting to fight off new threats.
Right, it's true.
But those changes, they're happening in somatic cells, not germline cells. So it's selection, but not in the classic Dawkins sense.
Interesting. So it's expanding the concept of selection beyond just genes.
Exactly. And then other philosophers, they question that whole emphasis on perfect copying.
Okay, so Dawkins said replicators are good at making accurate copies. But what if that's not the whole story?
Yeah, they say, look, what really matters for evolution is that things are similar enough across generations to maintain their function. It doesn't have to be perfect replication.
So like a blueprint that gets slightly modified each time but still produces a functional building.
Exactly. And Godfrey Smith, he's been a big voice in this critique. He says similarity, not just copying, is what drives evolutionary change.
Okay, and did Hull ever respond to these criticisms?
He did. Interestingly, later on, he seemed to concede that organisms themselves could be considered replicators, at least in cases of asexual reproduction.
Okay, so like bacteria that just divide in two.
Exactly. So it kind of blurs that sharp line that he initially drew between genes as replicators and everything else.
So replicator selectionism, well, it gives us a really interesting way of thinking about heredity and selection.
Uh-huh.
It's not without its own philosophical wrinkles.
It's definitely not a simple story.
Now, let's go back to a really fundamental question that we touched on earlier. Is evolution itself actually a necessary outcome for natural selection to be happening?
Ah, that's a juicy one. And it gets right to the heart of how we define and understand evolutionary theory.
So what are the different philosophical camps here?
Well, a lot of big names in evolutionary biology, folks like Lewontin Godfrey Smith, John Maynard Smith, They've all argued that natural selection basically defines what evolutionary theory is about.
Okay.
And often that implies that evolution, some kind of change in the population over time, that's a necessary consequence of selection happening.
So no change, no evolution, no natural selection.
That's the gist of their argument. And it seems logical, right?
It does, but you're telling me there are other philosophical perspectives.
There are, and even Darwin himself, he might have disagreed with this view.
Really? No, that's interesting.
Yeah, so Darwin, he did all this work on heterostyle in plates.
Okay, remind me what that is.
It's where you have different forms of flowers within a population. Some have long styles, some have short styles, and so on.
Okay.
And Darwin, he came up with this explanation for why these different forms persist. It's all about promoting cross-pollination.
So the different forms help each other out.
Exactly. And he explicitly said this was a case of selection happening without any directional evolution. The different forms, they're maintained because they're all beneficial in this particular context.
So it's like selection is working to preserve the status quo, the diversity, rather than driving change.
Exactly. And this isn't just some weird, quirky example from the 19th century.
Yeah.
More recent research has uncovered tons of examples of selection maintaining polymorphisms.
Polymorphisms meaning?
Just different forms or variants within a population. So it's challenging this whole idea that evolution has to be happening for selection to be happening.
That's a pretty big deal.
It is, and the source material, it even uses the simple model of diploid evolution to illustrate the point.
Okay, you're going to have to walk me through this one.
All right, so imagine you've got a population with 2 alleles for a gene,
Okay.
and you've got 3 possible genotypes, the 2 homozygotes and the heterozygote.
Right.
And each genotype, it has a certain fitness, a measure of how well it does in terms of survival and reproduction. Now, the key here is the fitness of the heterozygote.
Okay, so how well the heterozygote does compared to the 2 homozygotes.
Exactly. So if the heterozygote has the highest fitness, what happens?
Well, I remember from my genetics class that that's called overdominance, and it leads to a stable equilibrium.
You got it. So the population evolves towards a certain mix of genotypes, and then it just stays there.
Okay.
Now, here's the philosophical kicker. If we say that evolution is necessary for selection to be happening, then we're basically saying that Darwin's theory applies while the population is moving towards that equilibrium.
Okay.
But then once it reaches equilibrium, selection magically stops happening even though the heterozygote is still fitter.
Right, the selective pressures haven't gone away. They're still there maintaining that equilibrium.
Exactly. So it seems really weird to say that the theory suddenly stops applying just because the population has reached a stable state.
Yeah, it's like saying gravity stops working once an object hits the ground.
Exactly. It just doesn't make sense. And it gets even more complicated when we bring in genetic drift.
Right, that randomness that's always lurking in the background.
Yeah, so even in a system with overdominance where the heterozygote is super fit, the population, it's not going to stay perfectly fixed at that equilibrium point.
Because of drift.
Exactly. There's going to be some random fluctuation around that point. Sometimes the allele frequencies will drift a bit closer to the equilibrium, sometimes a bit further away, and sometimes they'll just stay the same by pure chance.
So if evolution is necessary for selection, are we saying that selection is like flickering on and off in these cases?
That's the philosophical problem. It just doesn't seem like a coherent way to think about it.
Yeah, it feels like we need a more robust way of understanding the relationship between selection and evolution.
And then there's this really interesting argument from Robert Brandon.
What does he say?
Well, he compares drift to inertia in physics.
Okay.
He says, look, in Newtonian physics inertia, that's the default state of an object.
Yeah.
It's going to keep moving in a straight line at a constant speed unless some force acts on it. And Brandon, he says, drift is like the inertia of biological systems. It's the default expectation.
So things are going to randomly drift unless some other force-like selection comes along and pushes them in a particular direction.
Exactly. So maybe we shouldn't even require selection to be happening for evolutionary theory to apply. Maybe it's all about understanding how drift and other forces interact to produce the patterns we see in nature.
That's a pretty radical idea.
It is. It
Yeah.
really challenges our traditional way of thinking about evolution.
So the whole project of defining the conditions for evolution by natural selection,
Yeah.
it might be about more than just figuring out when we can say this is a case of natural selection.
Absolutely. It could be about uncovering deeper principles about biological systems, about how change and stability are intertwined, about the role of chance and necessity in the history of life.
Okay, so lots of philosophical food for thought there.
Always. Now let's shift gears again and talk about how natural selection is treated in those more formal mathematical models that we touched on earlier.
Right, you said something about it being the interpretation of a component of a formalism.
Yeah, that's how philosophers often think about it in this
What
context.
does that mean exactly?
So remember we talked about the focused sense of natural selection.
Right, where you're zeroing in on a specific aspect of the process.
Exactly. So in this case, natural selection, it's not the whole Darwinian shebang.
Okay.
It's the specific meaning we give to certain mathematical quantities within these models.
So it's like we're using math to represent aspects of the biological world, and then we have to figure out what those mathematical symbols actually refer to.
Yeah, it's about connecting the abstract mathematical world to the messy biological world.
Right, because math is all about precision and abstraction, and biology is all about squishy, complicated organisms.
Exactly. So two of the main types of models that philosophers use to study natural selection are type recursion models and the price equation.
Okay, we talked about those a bit earlier.
We did. And it turns out that how selection gets interpreted philosophically, it's quite different between these two frameworks.
Okay, so let's start with type recursion models. What are the key philosophical ideas there?
So these models, they're basically sets of equations that describe how the frequencies or numbers of different types in a population change over time,
Types meaning,
like genotypes or phenotypes, different genetic makeups or different observable traits.
right.
And they're called recursive because the state of the population in the next generation,
Uh-huh.
it's calculated based on the state of the population in the current generation.
So it's like a step-by-step process. You figure out what happens in generation 1, then generation 2, then generation 3, and so on.
Exactly. And those fitness coefficients, those little Mao values we talked about,
Yeah.
they often play a starring role in these models.
And those are interpreted as a measure of selection.
That's right. So for a philosopher, a higher fitness coefficient means that particular type has a stronger selective advantage.
Okay, makes sense.
Yeah.
And these models, they can get pretty fancy, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And
They can incorporate all sorts of factors that philosophers are interested in.
like,
Well, like drift, for example, that randomness we talked about. They often model that using the concept of effective population size.
okay.
And then there's frequency-dependent selection, where the fitness of a type depends on how common it is in the population.
So if everyone's doing it, it's no longer advantageous.
Right. And then there's density-dependent selection, where fitness is affected by how crowded the population is.
So your fitness depends on your neighbors.
Exactly. And then you can even have selection pressures that change over space or time.
So it's not always a static, unchanging environment.
Nope, things can get really dynamic. So philosophers like John Beatty and Roberta Milstein, they've argued that these fitness coefficients in type recursion models, we should think of them as representing this process of discriminate sampling.
Okay, so certain types are more likely to make it into the next generation because of their inherent properties.
Exactly. They contrast this with drift, which they see as a process of indiscriminate sampling.
Okay, so selection is picking and choosing, whereas drift is just random.
That's the idea. And these type recursion models, they can even be extended to look at selection happening at different levels of organization,
Okay.
like between groups of individuals.
So it's not just individuals competing against each other, it's also groups competing against other groups.
Right, and some models, they incorporate parameters like group fitness or collective fitness to represent this.
That opens up a whole other can of worms philosophically.
It does. It raises all sorts of questions about the units of selection and what it even means for a group to have fitness.
Right. We could do a whole other deep dive on that.
We totally could. But for now, let's move on to the price equation. How does that framework handle selection, and what are the philosophical implications?
Okay, so the price equation, it's a different beast altogether, right?
It is. It's not a step-by-step recursive model like type recursions.
Okay.
It's more like a snapshot.
Yeah.
It gives you a mathematical description of how the average value of a trait in a population changes over a single generation.
Okay, so it's looking at the change between one generation and the next.
Exactly. And it does this by breaking down the total change into two main components.
Okay.
The first component is the covariance between the trait and reproductive success.
So how much do individuals with a certain trait tend to out-reproduce individuals without that trait?
That's right. And this covariance term, it's usually interpreted by philosophers as representing the effect of selection.
Okay, so that's where selection is showing up.
And then there's the second component.
Hit me with it.
This one captures any biases or changes in the average trait value that happen during transmission from parent to offspring.
Okay, so stuff that can happen when traits are being passed down.
Exactly. And philosophers, they might attribute this to factors other than selection, like developmental constraints or mutations.
Okay, so the price equation, it's giving us this nice, clean separation between selection and other stuff.
That's the idea. And it's a really powerful tool for analyzing evolution. But here's where things get philosophically interesting.
I knew there was a catch.
There's always a catch. The interpretations of selection within type recursions and the price equation, they might not actually be compatible with each other.
Whoa, hold on. So we've got these two different mathematical frameworks,
Uh-huh.
and they're giving us different answers about what selection is doing.
Yeah, and that's a big deal for philosophers because it raises questions about whether we're really capturing the same underlying biological reality with these different tools.
Okay, so what's the philosophical breakdown here?
So in type recursion models with those fixed fitness coefficients, the strength of selection for or against certain types, it stays the same over time as long as those coefficients don't change.
Okay, so selection is constant.
Right. But in the price equation, that covariance term, the one that we're interpreting as selection,
Uh-huh.
it can change from generation to generation as the frequencies of different types in the population shift, even if the biological relationship between the trait and reproductive success stays the same.
Okay, so selection can be fluctuating.
Exactly. So it's a very different philosophical picture of how selection operates over time.
Constant selection versus fluctuating selection. And the example of heterozygote superiority really brings this out, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah. That's a perfect illustration. So remember, in a scenario with heterozygote superiority, the fitness coefficients in a type recursion model, they stay the same.
Right, because the heterozygote always has the advantage.
Exactly. And the population, it evolves towards a stable equilibrium and then it just hangs out there.
Okay.
But if we analyze the same scenario using the price equation,
Uh-huh.
that covariance term, our measure of selection in this framework, it actually shrinks down to 0 as the population approaches equilibrium.
Why is that?
Because at equilibrium, there's no more change in allele frequencies. So, according to the price equation, selection is effectively gone, even though those fitness differences are still there, doing their thing, maintaining the equilibrium.
So one framework says selection is constant, the